When I examine the figure known as Superman, what strikes me first is not his power, but his wound. Before he could even form language, before he could attach meaning to the world around him, he was violently separated from his origin. I have long maintained that the earliest experiences of a child, those occurring before conscious memory, leave the deepest scars, precisely because they are unspoken and unprocessed. Superman's departure from Krypton was not a choice, but an expulsion shaped by catastrophe. Thus, he carries within him a primal rupture, a loss of home, of belonging, of the first objects of love. This trauma becomes the silent blueprint of his entire psyche. Every patient I have studied who suffers from profound detachment exhibits a similar pattern, an unending longing for a place that no longer exists, or perhaps never fully existed. Superman embodies this phenomenon in its purest form. His Kryptonian origin becomes a mythic memory, both idealized and unreachable. In psychoanalytic terms, we could say that he suffers from a persistent melancholia, a grief that cannot be completed because the lost object is not merely a parent, but an entire world. This absence shapes his emotional life far more profoundly than any superhuman ability. It is essential to understand that such an early trauma does not fade simply because the individual grows strong or capable. On the contrary, the more extraordinary the individual becomes, the more he is compelled to create meaning around that original loss. Superman's relentless commitment to protecting Earth is not merely altruism. It is a psychic attempt to rebuild what was taken from him. By saving others from destruction, he symbolically rescues the infant self who could not save Krypton. His heroism, therefore, is not solely moral. It is compensatory, a grand attempt to repair the rupture that shattered his life. I observe in him a constant tension between two identities: the Kryptonian child who lost everything, and the Earth adult who must pretend to be whole. This duality mirrors the universal psychological conflict between the private self and the social self. Clark Kent is the ego's mask, constructed, deliberate, fragile. Superman, on the other hand, expresses the deeper, more instinctual forces shaped by trauma and longing. Yet neither form resolves the internal wound. They coexist as two strategies to manage existential displacement, one through concealment, the other through symbolic restitution. What fascinates me is that Superman's powers, flight, strength, invulnerability, can be interpreted as psychic fantasies of the abandoned child. The infant who lost his world dreams of becoming powerful enough to prevent loss from ever happening again. Thus, his abilities function as wish fulfillments, manifestations of omnipotence that counterbalance the helplessness of his earliest moments. But unconscious wounds do not disappear simply because one becomes physically strong. Instead, his powers make the burden heavier, for he must constantly live up to the symbolic ideal he created to survive. Superman represents the profound truth that even the most extraordinary individuals are shaped by their earliest traumas. His story reminds us that strength often emerges from the deepest wounds, and that the drive to protect others is frequently rooted in the desire to heal oneself. In my clinical experience, the most heroic impulses arise from the need to restore what was broken within. Superman is not merely the last son of Krypton. He is the eternal child searching for the home he lost before he could understand its meaning. And in this search, he reveals what is most human within us all: the longing to mend the first fracture of our lives. When I examine the figure of Clark Kent, I immediately perceive that he is far more than a simple disguise. He is, in fact, a carefully constructed psychic mechanism, a defensive armor engineered not to hide weakness, but to perform it. In my clinical experience, I have observed that individuals who fear the destructive magnitude of their own impulses often adopt exaggerated gestures of modesty, shyness, or restraint. Clark's hunched posture, his soft voice, his avoidance of confrontation, these are not accidental. They constitute a deliberate suppression of the self, a method to neutralize the overwhelming power that lies dormant within him. This persona is a psychological compromise, a way to exist among others without revealing the tension between his immense potential and his deep fear of misusing it. The timidity of Clark Kent can thus be understood as an externalization of an internal struggle. Every subject, regardless of their origins, carries within themselves forces that can both create and destroy. In the case of Superman, those forces are magnified to mythical proportions. If he were to act with complete spontaneity, without filters, without restraint, he could devastate the world around him. Therefore, Clark becomes not a mask of protection from others, but a mask that protects others from him. He invents an identity that appears harmless, even laughable, to ensure that no one suspects the magnitude of the conflict that wages beneath his quiet facade. It is important to note that Clark Kent embodies a paradox commonly found in the human psyche. The more powerful the instinctual drives, the more elaborate the defenses that rise to contain them. Many of my patients who feared their own anger would adopt excessive politeness. Those who feared rejection would behave with exaggerated humility. Superman's alter ego functions in precisely this manner. His glasses, his clumsiness, his hesitations are symbolic objects, rituals of self-control meant to reassure both himself and society that he is safe to be among them. He does not merely hide his power, he actively diminishes himself, collapsing his cosmic grandeur into the shape of an ordinary man. In this light, Clark Kent becomes a psychological sanctuary. Within this identity, Superman can experience the vulnerability he lost the moment he discovered his true nature. As Clark, he is allowed to be unsure, to fail, to desire affection without the burden of being an icon. I have seen many individuals adopt similar patterns. They create versions of themselves that feel manageable, less frightening, more human. Clark is not the lie, Superman is. The cape represents the fantasy of mastery, while Clark reflects the hidden craving for simplicity, intimacy, and acceptance, needs that no amount of heroism can erase. Yet this dual identity creates a profound tension, for no mask can entirely dissolve the truth that lies beneath it. Clark Kent constantly negotiates the anxiety of exposure, the fear that someone will glimpse the immense power he tries so desperately to suppress. This fear mirrors the universal human dilemma, the terror that our true desires, instincts, or wounds will be revealed. The more a subject relies on a defense mechanism, the more fragile it becomes, for it must be maintained constantly. Clark's exaggerated meekness demands relentless vigilance. One slip, one uncontrolled gesture would unravel the delicate equilibrium he has built. Thus, Clark Kent is not a superficial disguise, but a profound psychological structure. Through him, Superman survives the burden of his own existence. I would argue that it is not the heroic feats that sustain him, but the quiet, restrained human moments lived under the mask. Clark is his grounding, the vessel through which he processes fear, longing, and the eternal question of belonging. And in this conflict between the omnipotent being he is and the fragile human he pretends to be, we encounter the essence of his psyche, the eternal struggle to reconcile power with vulnerability, destiny with desire, and the extraordinary with the profoundly human. When I examine the figure of Superman, I immediately perceive that he is not merely an extraordinary individual endowed with impossible powers. He is, above all, a psychological construction. He embodies what I have long described as the ideal ego, the perfected image of ourselves that we strive to reach but inevitably fail to become. Human beings tormented by internal conflicts, moral ambivalence, and unfulfilled desires create an external symbol onto which they project their longing for absolute coherence. Superman is this projection made flesh. He is not who we are, nor who we realistically could be, but the luminous image of who we wish we were when freed from the burdens of doubt, weakness, and contradiction. As I reflect on humanity's fascination with this hero, I see that he absorbs the moral aspirations people struggle to uphold in their daily lives. Strength without corruption, courage without hesitation, goodness without ambiguity. Such things do not exist in the human psyche, which is inherently divided and shaped by competing impulses. Yet through Superman, individuals imagine a being in whom the ego, id, and superego coexist harmoniously, as if the conflicts that carve the human soul could somehow be transcended. In creating him, humanity expresses its yearning to escape its own psychological limitations. But what interests me deeply is not simply why Superman is admired, but why he must be infallible. This need reveals a profound dissatisfaction individuals feel toward their own moral fragility. They look at themselves and see compromise, indecision, and emotional turmoil. Thus, they elevate Superman as a mirror polished of all imperfections, a figure who reflects not their lived reality, but their ideal selves. In him, they fantasize that every internal fracture can be healed, that every impulse can be mastered, and that goodness can exist in a pure, unconflicted state. He becomes the antidote to the disappointment people feel toward their own humanity. Furthermore, I observe that Superman functions as a psychic refuge. When individuals confront their failures, anxieties, or moral shortcomings, they often experience a painful fragmentation of the ego. But by identifying with Superman, even momentarily, they engage in a reparative fantasy. They imagine themselves capable of soaring above the chaos of their inner world, embodying the unshakable integrity and confidence that eludes them in daily life. This identification does not transform them, of course, but it temporarily soothes the tension between who they are and who they aspire to be. In truth, Superman's perfection is both comforting and tormenting. While he offers a vision of absolute moral clarity, he also reminds individuals of their inability to reach such a state. Every time they witness his unwavering dedication, they confront the disparity between their ideals and their actions. This gap between the ego and the ideal ego can become a source of persistent guilt, a feeling that one is forever falling short. Thus, Superman serves a dual psychological function. He inspires admiration and simultaneously reinforces the sense of inadequacy inherent to the human condition. Finally, I must emphasize that the very reason Superman holds such mythic power is because he is not real and cannot be. His perfection is necessary precisely because human beings are imperfect. He is the psychological horizon toward which the ego walks, knowing it will never arrive. And yet, this unattainability does not diminish the hero's value. Rather, it enhances it. For in striving toward an ideal, even one forever out of reach, individuals gain direction, purpose, and meaning. In this sense, Superman is not merely a hero, but a psychic compass guiding humanity toward its highest aspirations, however unreachable they may be. As I observe the figure of Lex Luthor, I immediately recognize the unmistakable signature of envy in its most archaic form, a psychological wound that gnaws from within. Luthor does not merely dislike Superman, he suffers because Superman exists. His psyche is organized around a single tormenting comparison. There is someone above me. In psychoanalysis, I have encountered countless individuals who are unable to tolerate the brilliance or success of another. And in each case, the hatred they externalize is but a distorted mirror of the inferiority they feel internally. Luthor's resentment is not born of reason, but of a deep, primitive anguish, the fear of being insignificant in the face of a superior other. In Luther's obsession with destroying Superman, I see a classic structure of symbolic castration. This does not refer to physical mutilation, but rather the terror that one's power, autonomy, or worth has been diminished by a rival figure. Superman embodies an unattainable ideal of strength and moral purity, and therefore he threatens Luther's fragile sense of self. I have long taught that the ego reacts violently when confronted with a reminder of its own limitations. Luther's aggression is thus a desperate attempt to reclaim a sense of dominance, to assert that he, not Superman, defines the order of the world. His hatred disguises a deeper truth. He cannot bear the idea of being overshadowed. The irony, of course, is that Luther's intelligence is extraordinary, and yet he remains tormented precisely because he demands that his worth be absolute. In my analytic practice, I have witnessed how the individual who cannot accept relativity, the one who insists on being the best, the strongest, the most admired, becomes a prisoner of his own narcissism. Luther's greatness becomes meaningless to him the moment he realizes someone else surpasses him. His brilliance is never enough because he does not strive merely to be exceptional. He strives to be alone at the summit, unchallenged and unthreatened. Superman's presence renders this fantasy impossible. Superman, in this dynamic, functions not as an enemy, but as a symbolic mirror that reflects Luther's deepest insecurities. The hero's existence exposes the illusion of self-sufficiency that Luther clings to. My theory of the ego teaches that narcissistic individuals often experience admiration for others as a personal attack. Luther cannot admire Superman. He must annihilate him, because to acknowledge Superman's greatness would be to confess his own vulnerability. What appears as ambition is, in truth, a profound defense against shame. The shame of being ordinary in the shadow of someone extraordinary. If I were to analyze Luther on the couch, I would trace this obsession to early wounds. Experiences that taught him that love must be earned through superiority and that weakness invites humiliation. Such a subject learns to equate dependence with danger and admiration with defeat. In adulthood, the psyche replays this early drama on a grander stage. Thus, Luther's battle is not with Superman, but with the emotional ghosts that haunt him. His mind has fused the hero with the internal figure of the rival who once threatened his sense of worth. To destroy Superman is to destroy the intolerable feeling awakened within himself. In the end, I would conclude that Luther embodies the tragedy of the ego that cannot accept limitation. Whereas Superman represents the idealized image we aspire to, Luther represents the fracture created when the ego demands perfection for itself alone. His paranoia, his hatred, his relentless drive to dominate all stem from the fear of symbolic castration, the fear that another's greatness negates his own. And so, his story is not merely that of a villain opposing a hero, but of a man imprisoned by envy, forever tormented by the shadow cast by a being who, without intention, exposes the fragility of his soul. When I observe Superman's attachment to Lois Lane, I immediately recognize a psychological dynamic that far transcends romantic attraction. I see in Lois the embodiment of what I call the object of desire, the figure through which the divided self seeks unification. Superman, torn between the limitless power of his extraterrestrial nature and the fragile vulnerability of his human persona, gravitates toward Lois because she represents the bridge between these fractured identities. She perceives the hero and the man, the divine and the ordinary, and thus symbolizes the promise of inner reconciliation. It is natural, therefore, that his desire for her is not merely sentimental, it is profoundly existential. In my clinical experience, every individual carries within them a tension between who they feel they ought to be and who they fear they truly are. Superman's duality magnifies this universal struggle. Clark Kent, timid and restrained, embodies human limitation, while Superman expresses omnipotence, moral clarity, and the fantasy of perfection. Lois becomes the gravitational center that anchors both sides. She is the witness capable of holding his contradictions without rejecting either. For this reason, his bond with her is not accidental but structurally necessary. Through her, he seeks what all psyches ultimately crave: coherence. To understand this dynamic, one must examine the mechanics of desire. We do not desire randomly. We desire that which restores a missing piece of ourselves. Lois Lane, through her courageous curiosity and her unwavering sense of justice, evokes in Superman the very qualities he wishes to harmonize. She loves Clark for his humanity and admires Superman for his grandeur. In her gaze, he is not split into two incompatible figures. Instead, he is accepted as a whole. Thus, she becomes the mirror in which he sees the possibility of integration, a symbolic mother, lover, and mediator of opposing forces. Many would assume that Superman's love for Lois is driven by her admiration, yet the opposite is true. It is her ability to challenge him that he finds most compelling. Lois does not idealize the hero to the point of submission. She questions him, confronts him, and constantly tests the boundaries of his moral certainty. In this way, she prevents him from collapsing into the omnipotent fantasy that threatens every powerful figure. She tethers him to the human world, reminding him that even the mightiest being requires dialogue, humility, and emotional exposure. Her presence protects him from the psychological isolation that absolute power inevitably produces. From a psychoanalytic perspective, their relationship functions as a negotiation between eros, the drive toward connection, and the inner fractures that haunt the psyche. When Superman turns to Lois, he's not seeking flattery, but affirmation of his struggle, the tension between duty and desire, strength and tenderness, destiny and freedom. Lois does not resolve these contradictions for him, yet she gives them a container, a relational space where they can coexist without tearing him apart. She becomes the symbolic anchoring point that allows him to navigate a world that fears his power even as it relies upon it. Thus, I conclude that Lois Lane is far more than a romantic partner. She represents Superman's quest for psychic unity. Through her, he pursues not simply love, but wholeness, the integration of the human and the divine, the fragile and the indestructible. She is the object through which he attempts to reconcile the fragments of his identity into a single coherent self. Without Lois, Superman would remain a divided being, forever oscillating between extremes. With her, he approaches the fundamental aspiration of all individuals, to become, finally, one with oneself. As I reflect upon the psyche of Superman, I perceive in him a conflict far older and far deeper than the battles he fights in the external world. It is the struggle between Krypton and Smallville, two symbolic origins that shape his internal landscape. Krypton represents his biological destiny, the inherent power, instinct, and determinism written into his very cells. Smallville, on the other hand, symbolizes the world of nurture, the moral teachings, human affections, and cultural constraints that formed his ego. Within him, these two realms collide endlessly, and this conflict is the source of his lifelong tension. Krypton embodies what I would call the id, in its purest, most exalted form, raw potential, instinctual drive, and unmediated power. It is the place of his ancestry, the genetic imperative that whispers to him that he was meant for something larger, something beyond human comprehension. Yet this magnificent destiny arrives to him only as ghostly memory, stories, symbols, and crystalline echoes. This absence deepens the pull, for what is inherited but unseen often becomes even more psychologically potent. Krypton is the origin he can never return to, and thus it becomes a permanent wound within his unconscious. Smallville, by contrast, is the cradle in which his ego was shaped. It is the land of human warmth, parental love, gentle guidance, and moral boundary setting. Jonathan and Martha Kent serve as the architects of his superego, teaching him restraint, compassion, humility, and duty. They cultivated in him a sense of moral responsibility that stands in direct opposition to the unrestrained power he naturally possesses. In psychoanalytic terms, Smallville is the humanizing force, what turns instinct into intention, power into purpose, and alienation into belonging. From this duality arises a fundamental psychic tension. Is Superman who he is, or is he who he was taught to be? Krypton demands that he embrace the fullness of his alien nature, his exceptionalism, his near-divinity. Smallville insists that he remain grounded, approachable, familiar, someone who protects, rather than dominates, the fragile human world that raised him. This opposition forms the core of his identity crisis, the battle between destiny and creation, between cosmic inheritance and earthly morality. In analyzing him, I recognize that his greatest suffering comes not from external enemies, but from the perpetual negotiation between these two inheritances. He fears the possibility of losing himself to his Kryptonian side, becoming a figure of overwhelming force, detached from human emotion. Yet he also fears suppressing that same power to the point of self-denial, living forever as Clark Kent, a persona too small for the enormity of his being. His psyche oscillates between expansion and containment, between transcendence and modesty, between the star and the farm. Ultimately, Superman strives to unify these opposing forces, attempting to build an identity that honors both the planet he lost and the world that welcomed him. His journey is not merely heroic, but profoundly psychological, a quest to integrate two incompatible origins into a cohesive self. This is the destiny of all individuals, but in him it is magnified to mythic proportions. For in reconciling Krypton and Smallville, he is, in truth, attempting to reconcile instinct and morality, power and humility, the self he inherited and the self he was shaped to become.